one point in time, a few months back, that helped me to identify a personal symbol of power that has ended up making its way into some of my work. So I've long appreciated that about you, Christi. I'm glad you could join us. To get us started, how about in the chat, you answer this question? You may have already heard it. To what extent have you experienced magic in your recent life, like in the last week or month or so? Think about that one. Something magical, something mystical, something you couldn't explain any other way.
And also feel free to give a shout out to your home state where you are. So it's always fun to see everyone's where you are roll through the chat. That way we can give hollers.
Yeah, I love that too.
I will say that I thought I'd experienced magic very recently. When I've been looking here at Brasstown, the folks, I've been looking for a quilting frame. And so I asked the universe, give me a quilting frame. And then I stopped in the local quilt shop and someone's like, oh, here you go, you can have the one in my garage. I was like, brilliant, ask and you shall receive. Something that's not a quilting frame. Like it's a clothing rack, it's something else.
Oh.
Not a quilting.
So we'll say magic with an S.
Close to manifesting a quilting rack.
It's still coming. It's still coming. I have faith.
Oh, Melissa keeps running across the same message over and over of staying true to yourself. Books and movies. That's an amazing thing to be awake to and watching for. Swimming under the sunset and moon here in the Irish Sea from Rose and White. Oh. Rianne from Kick-Ass Quilts in the Netherlands has been using quilting to heal myself and life, my mission, magic alignment with things every day. We'll be talking a little bit about magical healing as well.
Laura says the snow and sunshine over town and lake were pretty magical. They say it's actually science, and I go ahead and push back and say, you define the difference. I don't know that science is not particularly magic. As a very science-prone, 8-year-old, I thought they were one and the same. If I could make a bottle explode with some household ingredients of, vinegar and baking soda, that seemed like magic to me.
Well, and if you boil it down, right, you know what quantum physics is all about? Based on my understanding, but that isn't quantum physics like once you zoom in as far as we can zoom in with our powers of observation, the tiniest elements of the universe are sometimes particles and sometimes waves. And it all depends on what we think we see, is what the scientists say. Now that sounds like magic.
Yeah, no,
it's all like 98% energy too, right?
Oh yeah, then you start to talk about string theory and observable science, where the particle is actually changes if you look at it. There's a lot of there's a lot of that stuff that gets very head scratchy, but also a little Gandalf if you really start reading hard.
Maybe we need to have a quantum physicist on the next episode of Softball.
Oh,
and how it relates to quilting.
I have a list of questions that I have been looking for a physicist for recently, so I'm all for it.
So if you know a quantum physicist,
help us manifest.
All right. What do you say we go ahead and begin? Y'all ready to get started? All right. So we're going to do a quick round of introductions, and then we'll jump into what we brought to share with you today. I'm Zach Foster. I am living in Brooklyn, New York, but I'm currently residing in Brasstown, North Carolina at the John C. Campbell Folk School, where I am their first ever artist in residence. And look what I got just this morning.
Ooh.
My very own name tag. This is their logo. It's a picture of a person singing behind a plow, because it's that idea of art and work interwoven. So I'm feeling very official this morning. Heidi?
Oh yeah.
Cool.
So I'm here in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and I do a lot of hand quilting, hand piecing, and I do a lot of hand embroidery on my quilts. I don't always bring it up, but that was kind of my gateway into becoming a quilter. So I was embroidering all the time, and I thought I would like to make something a little bit bigger. So that's a particular point of excitement for getting to talk to Christi today about embroidery. Luke?
Good morning, everyone. I'm Luke. Just moved to Los Angeles. I'm feeling sort of like, where am I from? But I've been watching sort of everyone's stories of snow and winter, and am very happy to claim Southern California. Yeah, I've been quilting for a long time. I come through architecture, so sort of macro quilting down to micro, whereas Heidi kind of comes from micro to macro. So it's fun to have these conversations. I get to have other input sources on scale. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for being here. And now our VIP guest of the month, Christi.
Hello, I'm Christi. I am in upstate-ish New York. I, quite the opposite of Luke, basically grew up in tropical weather, lived in LA for 10 years after living in Florida for 20 years, and now I live in New York and it's very cold, and I actually really love the snow. I love the winter time. I love having just like 6 months of the year to be like, I'm going to be inside working on my stuff and cooking food, cooking really elaborate meals. And I don't feel any responsibility to have to be out. I am a garment maker initially. I've always worked with quilting, embroidery, different sort of elements of that, but they've always been kind of in the context of creating garments. And I think for me, the aspects of quilting, embroidery, painting with different dyes all comes down to surface texture and surface design and creating pattern and intricacy on the surface of something as flat as a fabric, and whether that's stitching, sewing it together, however that is. So, yeah.
And Christi, I would like you to share, if you don't mind, why you were a couple minutes later than you wish you would have been for this meeting. I feel like folks need to know that story.
Yes. Basically the chicken fence has been open it's been snowed open, but the chickens have not been out of their coop because it's been cold, it's been really windy, and they don't like the wind ruffling their feathers. But today it was nice and sunny. So I was like, oh, I'll let them out. And then I tried to close the gate. And then so I was outside basically with a shovel trying to get the snow and get the ice off of the ground so that I could close the gate so that I wouldn't be sitting here worrying about them while they were out there. So that's because my chickens, they wanted to get out today. And I was like, I can't stop you ladies. It is really nice.
Wonderful. I mean, that's real life. And I'm glad you were able to take care of your chickens before you had to join us here at Softball. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
So when I was thinking about you joining us, Christi, I was like, well, so what do I want to share? And I was thinking about 2 quilts that I've made in particular that for lack of, or for the desire to be able to lump things in categories, I call them oracle quilts, because it's a process for me of taking a deep question I have about life, a question that is ungoogleable. There are no answers, right? Like you just have to dig inside and find it. So when I find myself really chewing on one of those questions, at times in the past, I've taken them to fabric. And so I want to show you 2 of those. And I think it might intersect really nicely with some themes you bring up later, I imagine. So without further ado, allow me to share my screen. One of these quilts you may have seen before if you're familiar with my work. It's been in my portfolio. It's been around since 2015, 2016. But the other one was probably a surprise to you because I haven't even finished quilting it. I just kind of made the top and stuck it in a drawer. But that doesn't make it any less meaningful. This first quilt is the first of what I would consider of the oracle quilts. And that was 2015. If you remember, we were sitting there watching the news each night, and we were watching the country of Syria just fall apart, right? We were watching seemingly endless streams of mothers and fathers and children and grandparents literally walking away from their homes, traversing through entire countries on their feet, and sometimes finding a welcoming and sometimes finding a closed door. And watching that, the effect of watching that night after night just left me feeling entirely helpless. Like what is a person with a certain degree of means and a certain degree of privilege on the other side of the world? Like what do I do? Like how do we live together was the question that I found myself asking over and over. Like is it inevitable that the world is just going to spiral into chaos, or can we find a way to live together? I kind of think that's what my mind was ultimately thinking. Is it inevitable that we're just doomed to atrophy, or is there hope? Is there light at the end of the tunnel? So I was taking that question that you can't Google, and I said, fabric, show me the way. And I went over to my chest of drawers, and I went down to the white drawer where I kept all my white fabric. Why white? I have no idea. I can tell you the effect of it though in just a minute. And I took those various shades of white fabric, and I just made a little strip. Is that the first strip was the one you see on the left-hand side of the quilt that runs from top to bottom on the left-hand side, and that was pretty. And so then I made a second strip, and you can see the second strip responds to the curves of the first, and the third strip responds to the curves of the first two, et cetera, et cetera. So each one is responding to the next. And the answer, and to say it out loud, this is not going to be revolutionary, so don't wait for like a moment of nirvana here, but it felt very real to me in the sense that if humanity is going to make it very far into the future, we have got to learn to make room for one another, that we can all exist on this planet together. There's room for us, but we have to be willing to adjust what we consider our boundaries a little bit and make space for our neighbors. And so when I look at this quilt now, I see, especially down the middle, maybe you can see that it kind of fans out towards the bottom. It almost feels like a river delta or something, right? Just this idea, this cascade. That's when I see the folks leaving their homes in Syria, right? Just this stream of humanity. And then I see other people adjusting or not adjusting to the changing needs of our neighbors and the people that we live with. And so I love this quilt. It gave me a certain framework, certain visual framework to think about what I see happening in the world around me, and then my response to it. It's only part of the answer, of course, right? There's a lot of things we can be doing, a lot of actions we can be taking. One of the effects, I don't always choose a title for the quilts, but I do for this one. I called it Shekinah. And if anybody's familiar with the Torah or the Old Testament, Shekinah was the glory of God made manifest in a cloud that would appear by day to the Israelites and then by night as a pillar of fire, if I remember the story correctly. And I love the idea of the glory of God appearing in a cloud. And that idea, that connection came to me when I was working on this quilt, and I had it mostly done, and it was up on the wall, the design wall, and I turn out the kitchen lights, because you know I sew in my kitchen. I turn out the kitchen lights to go to bed, and I turn around and I take one last look at this quilt, and because it's all white, it was just glowing in the ambient light from neighborhood street lights and stuff, and it felt like a certain manifestation of a divine presence. And so I thought Shekinah was a good shorthand for that. Technically, one thing I did with this quilt, and I know Heidi, you kind of ran with this idea too in one of your pieces, is what I love about the way this quilt turned out is that you can see how each individual block is kind of bordered, and that's really the seam allowance that you see shining through, the double layer of fabric shining through, and it's made even stronger by the fact that I put a dark sheet between the quilt top and the batting. So the dark sheet really heightens the contrast. That might be a fun trick you want to play around with at some point. So this is Oracle quilt number 1. The second one is this one. This one is unfinished, it remains unfinished to this day. It's not even a spectacular quilt, to be honest. But again, it's kind of like the product here is not as important as the understanding and the path forward that is created by the process of making it. And so this quilt was made, if that was 2015, this was 2016. Because real talk, all creative, I'm not gonna speak for everybody, but I'm gonna say that it is a common experience for creative folks to have long seasons of uninspiration, right? And I was in the middle of one of those seasons, and I hadn't quilted anything for months. I mean, partially due to the political situation at the time, partially due to my own personal stuff, depression, anxiety, etc. And so I just sat there and I hadn't done anything, and my cloth was all just kind of moldering in my chest of drawers. And one day I decided that I had the wherewithal to go ahead and sit back down at the sewing machine and try to make something. And so all I did was I went back to the chest of drawers. I picked fabrics that felt soft, felt beautiful, felt comfortable, felt approachable, felt manageable, all those things, right? Just easy. I wanted to make an easy, soft, and comforting quilt. And so I picked fabric based on how they felt and how my eyes received them, you know. And then I just sat down to sew, and this is a spinoff of, oh, I don't know my block names, you know, Heidi and Luke, you probably know it, but like a log cabin,
Courthouse Step.
courthouse steps. Thank you.
My favorite.
Yeah, no, it's a good one. You know, I'm not a technical quilter. I think I'm more of an aspirational quilter. So yes, courthouse steps. So it's a real basic pattern, but the magic happened when I finished it and I stepped back. I remember I was in like this like funky fog. The cloud hadn't lifted for a number of months. I was in this funky fog, and I stepped back in my kitchen to look. And what I saw looking back at me was almost like a celestial gate, or maybe a grate is a better word, right? Something porous with holes in it, and divine light shining through, saying, Zach, right now you don't know where you're headed in your future, but your future is already here. You just got to step into it. You just got to walk through those windows. You just got to get there. And so the idea of a more ideal future already existing and me just having to walk the path to get there brought me a lot of comfort, right? And so for me, this is another very significant quilt, at least on a personal level, as to, I mean, we all have stories about how quilts have helped kind of chart a course for us. And so this one, along with the Shekinah quilt, have both been really special for me. And so those are the two I wanted to share with you as a way of kind of laying the groundwork for what I expect, you know, what I hope to hear from other folks today.
Oh, it's beautiful, Zach. What was your initial reason for choosing white for that first quilt?
I don't know, intuition. I don't know. Maybe I was just so like washed out emotionally from the news.
Yeah.
It just resonated with that. I don't.
Yeah, I love how those kind of subconscious, subtle choices at first can then later hit you in such a powerful way, like yours did at night. All right, I'm going to share my screen. And I'm going to be showing my white quilt today too.
Hey.
All right. Yeah, so this is the first quilt that I made with the first ever quilt pattern that I wrote called the Scavenger Hunt quilt. And it's going to be the 2-year anniversary of this quilt pattern coming out in March. And I'm going to be doing an anniversary quilt along for it. It's kind of mind-boggling that March 2020 was such a moment, and that now it's been 2 whole years almost, both for me as a pattern maker and also for the way that that changed our lives so much. But my life really changed a lot because of this particular quilt as well. I remember looking through QuiltCon magazine and thinking like, how can I get another article in here this year? And realizing that it had a lot more quilt patterns in it than it had articles. So I thought I will write a quilt pattern so I can get perhaps in the magazine this year. And was just late at night, of course, the night before the thing was due, giggling to myself about the idea of making a scavenger hunt quilt pattern where people had instructions, kind of like Simon Says, that they have to follow rather than cut it to be this size. It was trace the side of your body. This block is a birthday block. So mine is 12 inches across and 13 inches down for my birthday. Over here, I've got chronological blocks where I found fabric in my stash that was momentous to me, and I arranged it in the chronological order of when I acquired the fabric. This top right corner is things I touch every day. So I've got my Fitbit that I still touch every day, but I have since replaced my toothbrush, and my phone charger I think is different because I replaced my phone, but I do still wear that same brand of underpants every day. So some things stay the same, and other things that I touch every day are long since passed. One of the more subtle prompts in the quilt pattern comes a little bit later, and this is one that, you know, I applied to be in the magazine and then got the congratulatory email about a month later saying that I was going to be an article because it wasn't a real quilt pattern because it couldn't be replicated exactly. But anyhow, I got an article in the magazine and I had, I think, 5 weeks to get the quilt made and the pattern made. And I was like flying to India the next day. So I designed the pattern while I was in India for 3 weeks and came home and cut all my fabrics, started piecing it, and then I flew to Colorado with the makery to teach, and I was finished piecing the quilt and I quilted it. I flew home on a particular day and then did the binding of the quilt, and then I mailed the quilt back to Denver, Colorado, where it was due to be photographed. because that's how things shook out. And during that time, I was doing a lot of reflecting, and I was telling my friend Indu, who's my yoga instructor, I did my yoga therapy training with her, and she was leading our trip. So we were in a car driving around in Rishikesh, and I was talking to her about the different prompts that I had in the pattern, and that I wanted something near the end of the prompts that would seal things and make it feel particularly special and speak to the way that you can infuse an intention into a quilt. So I made a block on the quilt called the manifestation block, where you have to think about what you want to manifest in your life, or is the quilt really urging you to manifest something? Like when you look at your quilt, when you look at the pattern and you think, that just isn't sitting right. It's not done yet. It needs something, right? You could put polka dots all over the quilt for all I care as the pattern maker. But is the quilt trying to get you to do something? Or is there something you want that you can put some intention behind? And so I looked at the quilt and saw where the silhouette of my edge of my body was. And I thought, I really wish I had someone to hold hands with through life. I have been single and lonesome for 7 long years. And I had just gone on a hike in Boulder with my friend Allie, and I was talking to her about that. And so I got back home and I laid down where my body would have been. And I used just some simple running stitch embroidery to trace my hand. And down here, you can kind of see in white thread, here, like my fingers. And then I traced someone else, like an imagined arm. I think I moved my body and traced my other arm to create this sensation of holding hands. And I kind of loved how suddenly these rabbit ears looked a little bit like maybe someone's legs, as another second figure in the quilt. And I went home, and literally like 5 days later, after I returned home from Boulder, I went on a date with my sweetheart, and we've been together for over 2 years now. And so it's just a really magical quilt for me, magical quilt pattern, and something that I have really heard and enjoyed from other people who've done the quilt, that it's nice when you really claim and articulately say and picture what you want, and you're not thinking about what you don't want, but instead you're thinking about what you do want. And so during the quilt along that I did in March when the pattern came out, this is the second variation of the same pattern. So you get the sense of how they are similar, but not identical. And here my manifestation area was again done with embroidery. And I wrote, I am in a state of vibrant good health. And I had been dealing with some, especially hormone-based health problems. And it was helpful to compose a statement that made sense, because it was a very painful thing. And in fact, all of my things that I touch every day connected to my health, of taking my temperature all the time, of having elderberries, of using special skin creams that I was making by hand. And it helped me step back and realize I am in fact in vibrant good health, even though I do have a health problem or two that I'm working on. And since then, my health has gotten tremendously better. So again, it feels like another win for the Scavenger Hunt quilt, of really infusing a powerful intention in my quilt pattern. This is one where I was thinking about trying and wanted to practice that. So this is an ambidextrous quilt that I made. And it's a sign of kind of being careful. Like I made a quilt about trying hard repeatedly and like trying and trying and trying and trying. And I think I kind of manifested like the energy of more trying by making a quilt about this. And so I did keep trying. But maybe that's not a kind of quilt that I would be as interested in making anymore, because maybe the joy isn't in the trying part for me. This, I think, is one of the most powerful manifestation quilts in my life. This was made for me before I was born by a lot of the people in my family. My grandmother coordinated it, and she made this umbrella block, and the jack jumps over the candlestick block. I think she made one more, but this is my Aunt Becky, who I see almost once a week. This is my mom's friend Patty, my Aunt Lori, my Aunt Rosie. Aunt Rosie did two of them because she's really good at embroidery. So Aunt Sylvia. And it was just so infused with intention and love for me, and the knowledge that I had a bigger community of people who loved me beyond just the people who lived under my roof and my 4-person family. So that reminder of extended family and extended care, I think, was very powerful me. And as you look at a lot of my quilts, I think I see evidence of this quilt in my work all the friggin' time. Like I use trapunto, I use embroidery, I use a white background that I applique stuff on. So anyhow, there's that. There's lots of influence from that quilt. This is a nice throwback. It's been almost exactly a year since we started doing soft bulk, if I'm remembering right. And I shared with Audrey Essery that I was trying to take photos of each quilt as I finished it this year, so I could remember that I was actually sewing a lot and not never getting to sew like I sometimes deceive myself into thinking because I'm like addicted. And so here I made 16 things this year, and it's a really nice feeling to be able to look at them and feel. And I actually made a lot more of these vases than just the 2 that are pictured here, but it was too many to keep taking photos of. So I can remember that in my little head too, that this is like the tip of the iceberg of what I made in a year. And now having it and being able to look at it in this really physical way is very helpful for me in setting intentions for what do I want to make next year. It's as I'm looking at 2022 and I'm thinking, what do I want to make this year? It's reminding me that I'm going to make a lot of quilts this year, and I could really do something powerful with them if they were all in one series together, or they all spoke to each other in a particular way. This is my first finish of the year. It's my first ever tie quilt, and it's my second version of my 3rd quilt pattern, which is the vignettes quilt. And then this is a new quilt that I'm working on. I am tracking 2021 because it was a very good year for me. And I want to try and look back and think about why was it such a good year? So maybe again, a nod to those Polaroids. I've completed 3 months and I want to do all 12 months and then add lots of other details to it. I'm the type of person, when I set out to make a diary, I like live a month and then I go back and I put in like, what did I do each of those days? So it feels very authentic for me that a diary could be a look back at a year I just completed, and like finally taking the time to write about it and talk about it. And these are a few of the other quilts that I've made that are in some way kind of storytelling or having a diary impact. These walks, I mapped 3 walks and they were all done mostly with embroidery. So those kind of spoke to me, with Christi being a guest here as well. But this is also a kind of diary. It's a look back at the scraps of fabric that I've made, and almost like the evidence, right? Like you wake up in the morning and your kitchen's a mess and you think, what did I do last night? You realize, oh yeah, I had a delicious something or other. That this gives me that feeling of like, oh yeah, these are scraps from a lot of quilts that I've made because I make a lot of quilts. And also there's a piece of a tablecloth, there's a piece of a skirt that I used to wear. There's some things that connect pretty deeply to my life. This one was very overtly diary that I made last year in 2021. This was the moon cycles from that 2020 October. And so that's a big thing I've been thinking about lately is what do I want to focus on this year, 2022 artistically? I think Zach and I are working on a friend date where we're going to talk about that a little bit more too. But yeah, it's a little bit of where I'm at with both magic and looking back and looking forward.
That's great. Heidi, I don't know how I missed the scavenger hunt quilt, but that's brilliant, truly brilliant. The idea of engaging people to make something that is truly their own through a series of prompts that aren't just measurements. That's cool.
Thank you. You know, I'm seeing Patrice's question about that as well. And I am going to be re-releasing the pattern. So it will be for sale on my website next month. And we'll have a little extra detail in it because I won't be confined to an 800 word limit or whatever I had last time. So yeah, details will be forthcoming in March. We will be sewing that quilt, but next month the pattern will be for sale.
So fun. Thank you for sharing.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, so I'm going to share my screen. Zach will laugh at me because it's Keynote. Okay. One day I'll get you to show me something better, but until then, I'm just going to use what my computer came with, like
no problem with Keynote.
Right. Anyway, so here we are, January, and talking with the amazing Christi, of course, is a lot about hands engagement with the object, right? I mean, certainly from sort of, garment through embroidery and all of that, kind of what that manifests as far as your engagement. And then, what's perfect here, Zach and Heidi and I didn't kind of brainstorm what we were going to present so that we could come together, but I'm really enjoying how there's sort of a through line conversation. So, Zach had, omens and kind of big ideas and kind of his experience on the object scale, and Heidi also kind of has these linear experience manifest in objects. So these objects become kind of the that trajectory of experience manifest physically. And so interestingly enough, I came through and I said, I want to talk about details. I'm going to show some details of some quilts. And not because I need you to know what the quilts are, and exactly the opposite, right? I want to talk about being a little bit more present. And I think handwork does that brilliantly. And again, kind of, wanting to kind of take our conversation with Christi and say, okay, what can I remember about my experience and sort of help share and help remind myself the positive qualities of handwork, right? I get mired in making exhibitions or does this whole quilt, especially if I'm making a portrait quilt, does it look like the thing it's supposed to look like? I'm going to step back and it's going to be about the entire breadth of time of the object. And I forget what it means. Heidi's talking about sort of the act of sewing and this, the enjoyment of the experience. And I'm so often removed from that because I'm trying to create something that I either want attention from because it's an exhibition, or I need to sell, or I want to make sure this idea manifests in that it looks like what it's supposed to look like. And in some ways, you can't tell that until it's done. So I start from the beginning, entirely focused on what the end will be, and then all the time between is almost wasted in the just manufacturing of it. So I want to talk a little bit about just kind of details, and I don't have any big soapboxes about it except to say that there is some beauty in the sort of presence of experience, and you get to. And I think the objects end up being more interesting as a result of that if you are present with the material. I mean, looking behind Zach right now, there's just a lot of cool stuff going on. And, you want to get close to that. And, there's a lot of story and history in each of those pieces. So, this image on the screen now, it was a 30-foot flag that I cut down. I found it at Goodwill. But what happens is, as I was deconstructing it, there was some clean parts and some dirty parts and some parts that birds had engaged with. And so, I really got the story of the fabric. And for me, stories of fabric are really important. I use primarily reclaimed, reused, recycled material. And then the fabric has a story to it. And what you end up with is a conversation between you, the maker, and the fabric itself. In real time. And again, just the thing that I'm trying to think about here, coming through January, New Year, manifestations, all of that kind of rebirth stuff, is being a little bit more present with the act of making, and a little bit more precious with maybe the conversation with the owner, user, buyer, viewer, in the other people who are in the dialogue with what I'm making, right? Because I'm a maker, I'm an artist. And I think with that comes the intention of having other people engage with it. And I think that it's a challenge to trust the other side of that to be a part of the dialogue. It's really easy to just make things and just throw it out into the world and say, you guys should like this because I like it. As opposed to saying, here is why I like it. What do you think? And then, you get this really beautiful dialogue with the world. And I think material really allows for that in a way that maybe painting doesn't, right? You choose a bunch of colors, you put it on a thing, and then you get to talk about what you've made, and other people have different opinions. But in the world of fabric comes from somewhere. And maybe it's just a history of the material type, jeans or batik or woven or printed, or all of these have a long story to them. But sometimes the material itself was a shirt, was a sheet, was some pants that was worn until it was finished its life, or it was never worn because the style was terrible, or because the person who bought it didn't fit. I mean, and all of those are narratives existing in the material itself. And I think that there's some really brilliant subtext to kind of being present with the experience of engaging with the material, or hopefully the object. I don't think that everyone has to necessarily be a quilter to have to understand that fabric can be narrative, and that's something I just really wanted to talk about today, and talk about and just sort of share some of these examples of just material and details, but not necessarily talk about what the quilt is or where it goes or what it's about, because I spend so much time, my career is explaining why a quilt should be worth money, and why I've made something, and why someone should come look at it, or how someone else can remake it, right? Like that's the vast majority of my kind of output. And it's awesome, certainly not a complaint in the world, but I think this is a really fun opportunity to just kind of remind myself, and by proxy, everyone who's chosen to listen to me, that the sort of details and the experience and the material have an intimacy that I often forget. And kind of, I come from architecture, and so I'm always thinking about sort of spatial, human scaled environment and engagement with material, right? So again, I am kind of coming at a different at the top versus the bottom. I don't really know. There's no sort of top or bottom to making, but I didn't start with the enjoyment of stitching. I started with, I need to make a quilt. I need to make a thing that's this big so my legs are warmer. Architecture, like, let me design it in my brain, and then I just have to make the thing, as opposed to, gosh, it's cool that I've got a piece of thread that makes a stitch. Can I make something out of that? And so just kind of remembering the object's qualities that come through the act of making, and kind of what that means to exist in a space. And I'll leave you with a couple of more images of just, this was from a show, oh gosh, probably 6 years ago, of just some, you know, light engaging with these quilts that I hung up. And just kind of the things that I learned by taking a moment with what I had made, because I had made something and I was like, okay, I got to make this, it's done, okay, great. But then it turns out that if I took a moment, I could actually learn more through the act of making and hanging up than I had sort of, you know, it was kind of a cool moment for me to realize that, you know, the exhibition was more than just the sum of its parts, I guess. You know, it's not just me kind of regurgitating ideas and getting other people to look at it and me sort of being like, look at how cool I am for making a thing that I tried to make from the beginning. It actually gets to be something more interesting than that, because there's a thing in the world that does a thing I didn't expect, and then I get to learn from it and I get to experience. And you know, the objectness of quilting and the details of the material or the stitching or the size or the warmth or the folds or any of that gets to be this really great dialogue with human experience. And that's kind of where softbolt came from. It's, you know, this idea of kind of the weight of the experience of quilts. And I certainly will say, you know, quilts are what we talk about, but that can go far in any direction, you know, like loaves of bread, or, you know, any kind of crafts, or, you know, there's a lot of objects that we bring into the world that hold space in their materials and details and engagement that we maybe don't pay as much attention to some of the things they can teach you back. And by we, I of course am talking exclusively about myself, but the royal we gets makes me feel like, you know, I'm saying something, but really it's just, you know, I forget to kind of think of those details as important as the sort of aggregate of the whole thing. So you know, that's what I wanted to kind of bring to bear today as we work towards the magical Christi and hearing some of that. So thank you very much.
Luke, I'd like to just chime in for a second, if you don't mind. I don't know if it's just the result of all these softball conversations or the result of our friendship or a mix of all of the above. I don't know, but I think it is significant for me that the first 5 projects I got up here, 3 of them are behind me on the wall, are primarily excuses for interaction with people, right? They're quilts as conversation starters. And so I'm going to save the full conversation, of course, for another month when these are finished. But basically, these quilts are collectors of stories about what home means to us, right? And if you notice, I'm like looking down and doing stuff, I'm still actively listening, but I'm also opening up fan mail. Now, people have been sending me green samples of fabric, green leafy fabric, because what I want to do here in Murphy, North Carolina, is to sit down with people and talk about how we connect with the greater natural world around us. So again, just an excuse to interact with an object and then thusly connect more closely to one another. So I want to thank you for that, for whatever role that you have played in that for me. And I want to talk to you more about that at some point.
Anytime. Yeah, Christi, it's super excited to hear what stories you have to share. And of course, you know, try to limit my questions to only 1 million so that other people have an opportunity to wedge themselves in.
Oh, thanks, Luke. Yeah, so I mean, for me, I think just listening to these conversations and kind of thinking about it, a lot of my personal experience and my personal interaction with the work is very much sort of internal. And I tried to, before this talk, kind of think about the different ways in which working with textiles and my artwork in general kind of seeks to understand or seeks to express or seeks to and what I keep coming down to is that basically it's like the making is the medicine. Like whatever, I don't necessarily know what it is necessarily in the process, but oftentimes I can look back and just see clearly like, oh, okay, that's what you were dealing with. And that's how it came through. And maybe a lot of the times it looks like having, 17 different projects going on at the same time, because I don't, I'm like, I'm not dealing with that right now, whatever brought this into being, like, I'm not dealing with that right now. So I'm not going to put my time into that. Instead, I'm going to start a whole new one and get really detailed and then put that aside probably, and then go back to the other one. And it is so much about like having this sort of like medicine. So I'm going to share some of these and the different, I guess, the different medicines that I've discovered becoming sort of themes throughout the work. So I'm going to go ahead. So this is, I'm starting off kind of almost exactly 1 year ago. So this was my last year's, it's a larger piece, but this you can kind of see the core of it. It's still not done yet. This was like my birthday embroidery. And this one served in, one of the ways that I work with a lot is like as a reminder of intention. So this like lounging tiger, this is a not an exact replica of my cat, but it's pretty close. And it's just in a state of peace, just thinking about the way that cats exist in general, and the way that they just really embody, like when they need to be on, they're on, and when they don't need to be on, they are not worried. They're not sitting there worrying about it. They're not, dealing with different anxieties about what could be happening and what couldn't be happening. They are in action or they are relaxing. And so really kind of embodying that and bringing in a little bit of extra kind of sparkle and glam in the background and just a little more indulgence, I guess, and like being comfortable with that sort of indulgence felt like an important thing to bring into the year, especially 2021. It was just like, you know what I can do? I can enjoy my house and I can feed into that energy, and that is where I can find comfort, and I can enhance that. So that was really, this idea of reminder of intention. The next few are from the summer, and this is, I feel like this my summertime. I mean, I always want to embroider flowers. Flowers are just constant, but it's really about the capturing of a moment, like this capturing of a glimpse of time. And this one, again, half finished as per usual, sort of capturing the ease of summer, and this, whatever I was really, really thoroughly enjoying at the moment, of the vibrancy of the flowers, the hummingbirds that keep stopping by. And a little reminder, the sword and the edge is kind of like in those summer months, there's so much going on, there's so much abundance, there's so many plants that we really need to figure out what to cut out, what needs to be, basically, that was a big problem that we always had in the garden was like, oh, we'll just let it grow because it's so beautiful. And then it's like, okay, well, that plant is now choking the plant that we're trying to grow. So what needs to be cut out? Everything can grow abundantly. What can we decide that we no longer need? And so that was sort of like this capturing this moment of abundance and having that reminder of like what doesn't need to be here. We do have, this is a cultivated space. It's not the wild, as much as we like the garden space to be totally wild. It is up to us, just like in our own lives, as much fun as it is to have everything going on, just what can I cut out? So this Tithonia, this Mexican sunflower, can thrive in the garden and be visited by hummingbirds 1,000 times a day. Here's another capture from the summertime, again, just capturing the moment, capturing all of the colors. And I always look back at different photos of flowers and trying to kind of capture, just trying to remember what all of that was. And, especially as we move into February and March and start planning the garden, not planting, that won't happen till May. We start planning the garden again. It's going, okay, what are the kind of bringing in these different colors, these vibrant, it's not just a green plant, it has all these hues of blue and brown within it, and just trying to capture the essence of that moment. So yeah, we got reminder of intention, capturing the essence of a moment. And then sort of how Zach was talking about his oracle quilt, the attempt to kind of understand something was another sort of recipe. And those I find when I'm trying to understand greater concepts, it's not these like tiny little things going on in my head. Those usually end up happening on larger tapestries. Like this is probably 24 by 30 or something like that, as opposed to some of these tinier pieces like the previous flowers. And this one is just trying to understand everything. It's like there's a whole lot of information, a whole lot going on, and just trying to reduce that into the simplest form and trying to understand like what's kind of behind it all, trying to understand the more like universal aspect of things. And this is sort of a lighthearted view of that. And then there are other times where maybe that attempt at understanding these greater concepts took on a little bit more, like this one, for example, trying to understand like greater concepts of life and death, and kind of zooming out from what we know of in our experience of life and death, and considering the cycles of evolution, like how death has brought forth our existence, basically. Anytime the cycles of evolution require that death happen, it is an integral part of life. And so kind of working with that, and then, choosing this larger format, and then getting into the tiny little details and the actual creatures, and kind of enjoying their essence, and really, really decorating and, emphasizing their sort of, I don't know, passing nature by just really adding as much as I possibly could to it. I don't know what those little blue dots are. Oh, I made a little square. Okay, I'm gonna try to lose that. So yeah, this idea of like trying to understand these greater sort of images. Another one is like tapping into existing stories, tapping into these veins of mythology that sort of run through. And this one's a little bit abstracted, but this, for me, this was sort of trying to capture the archetype of the hermit, specifically the hermit in the tarot, and trying to understand trying to understand its multifaceted nature, really. Not just that it is something that's alone, but understanding like where are the gems that lie in that aloneness, what can we find within that. And so incorporating this this like empty cloak, because the hermit in the tarot, if you're not familiar, is this cloaked figure, but what sort of how many like galaxies are available within that cloak, how much infinite information and possibility can be contained within that. Having this little light to guide our way, and then also understanding that like within that hermit energy. And so for me, the hermit, this is also the winter time. It's this deep winter time of year where we go inside and we really start to like kind of find the gems within there, using our light to find what really can nourish us. So the pentacle, symbol of earth, and that sort of discovering what is working. And the snake is really just this, we're constantly transforming, and not just having the snake in its singular form, but having this multicolored, many different shades of green and blue, and just transforming this sort of earthly element, and carrying that through. So yeah, just going a little bit deeper into understanding different stories. I don't remember how that one ended there. That one's on the next one. This one is another one, like considering the greater archetype of Saturn, the planet, the sort of planetary archetype of Saturn, and trying to understand how, as a person who is naturally not very responsible, kind of like things are a little bit chaotic and like whatever, like not important, nothing's important, and tapping into the nature of like, okay, when you start to thinking about the sort of tree energy of the stability, bringing in this triangular shape, working at the root, and creating a base that you can grow from and grow through, and you can have all of these tiny little branches going off and doing different things here and there, but really about being able to grow forward and growing up from this base. So this idea of like tapping into this deeper story. So yeah, that is kind of been working with. And then, the last one that I didn't have any slides for, but and it's something that I've been working with recently, is the idea of managing a feeling. And for me, it's really been, I start to get into smaller embroideries usually, but this, dealing with different feelings, especially dealing with feeling like a loss of control, or feelings of anxiety, and sort of having these, having your artwork as a point of focus for those feelings. So for example, having feelings like not really being in control, and not being able to, know what's going to happen, and we never know what's going to happen, but for some reason it comes out more than others. And that was this recent embroidery that I'm still working on. Once again, none of these are finished. And this piece, it was just kind of like, I have a heart, I am alive, my heart is beating, and like that, and like, what do I love? And kind of tapping into that feeling of like, how can I kind of really anchor into what I know to be true and what I can appreciate in the moment. And so there's the heart. And then there was birds outside the other day, and I was like, okay, there's birds outside. You know, my partner found an amazing bouquet of flowers at the grocery store, and it was like, he brought it home and I was like, oh my God, thank you so much. And so I just added one of those lilies in there. And so yeah, just kind of going, okay, what can I control, or what can I understand, or what can I connect with that I know to be right, and I know to be really positive, not necessarily positive, but I know that I can anchor into that and be like, okay, my heart is still beating. I am still alive. There is still a heartbeat. There is still a fire. You know, there is still warmth. Like literally there's a fire in the other room that is keeping me warm. And like all of those things is just kind of like tapping into that and really anchoring into those feelings. So yeah, there's sort of those different levels of medicine that I've seen, sort of the recurring themes throughout my work. Yeah. That's kind of it.
Oh, Christi, thank you. That's so beautiful to get to hear about.
Yeah.
You know, I'm also struck that you are the third author we've had on in a row. We
Oh, cool.
to Radric Karakafi, and then Laura Preston from Vesselando. And it seems to me, as someone who has not written a book, that it's just an epic amount of work and goal setting and certainly the ability to complete things. You're sharing so many wonderful unfinished things with us, but to get to that finish line of printing a book is so remarkable. I wonder if you could share a little bit with us about your book and maybe how it connects to some of the things that you shared with us today, or
yeah. I mean, the book was written, I mean, I think the timing was was interesting. It was written like throughout, basically, I wrote it and, chose all the symbols and did the majority of the writing in January and February of 2020. And then the majority of the stitching was done in March through June of 2020. And I was just like, just keep going. And I think once again, it was like, one of those, that dealing with that anxiety of like, I don't know what's going on. I don't know what's happening. And just like stitch after stitch after stitch. It was like, I know that I am stitching, an owl right now. And I know that this owl has a deadline. And that was like an ability to really just like, I didn't have anything else to focus on. So that was really helpful. But, as much as horrible things were, many people were dying, and it was really, I was like, I can't do anything about that. No one can do anything about that, but I do have this one thing that I can contribute to the world, and it might have nothing to do with science. It might have nothing to do with that. So it felt very, for me, I think, that did provide an opportunity for me to look away from the constant like, oh, something else, and really maintain focus. I think I kind of needed that. That was really, yeah. I love Laura's. I will be incorporating this owl has a deadline into my personal lexicon of motivational stuff. Yeah, exactly. So yeah.
That actually is so similar to what happened with me and my scavenger hunt quilt pattern, because I literally wrote the pattern while I was traveling internationally and made the quilt in fall of 2019, and then it was released at the very end of February 2020, and the quilt song was in March. So there's all these ideas I was thinking about, obviously pre-pandemic, and then getting thrust into it was just such a surprise to be working with those prompts
right.
in such a different time than what I was planning to be working on them. And it's interesting because I had some friends and makers who said, like, I just can't do this pattern right now. It is too deep. It is too hard. It is like, like I need to not think. And there are so many introspective questions connected to the pattern that didn't feel right. And then for other people, having that kind of weekly, every Friday a new prompt comes out and you've got something to work on, was very helpful with that one foot in front of the other, like just keep working. I also found that so much of my life's energy goes into planning classes and retreats, and the part that's maybe not the most fun, the behind the scenes part, and to then have to cancel classes where I had done all the work of planning it and selling it and advertising. And then to me, during that time, I did a lot of quilting and finishing quilts and sewing, and just had that wonderful feeling that like, this can't be taken away from me because it's so joyful to do the work. And yeah, I personally have found that to be helpful. And to get to teach quilting during this time also, I feel like is teaching a tool for coping and for surviving in so many ways. I imagine just with your book launching and then being able to feel like I'm providing you with some tools in some ways to make meaning and feel meaningful, even though you're not working towards science or towards something, that's like,
right. It's but giving people, tools.
And your heart needs to survive as well.
So
Christi,
I have a question for you, just as a maker. It's kind of an aside, I guess, but just how do you organize your time? How do you sort of
real talk?
Yeah, I mean that's as much an answer, like that. There's a lot of us who make that as their sort of decision. I know there's some people who kind of 9 to 5. There's some people who allocate between other jobs, like all of that. So I was just curious yours.
Right. No, I mean, I have like a very big part of my work has always been like, I make my own schedule. Like I have external deadlines, definitely. And those are really important. Like being able to have the publisher deadlines was really amazing because it was like, I don't get to push this around. This is written and somebody else is depending on me. And there's a team of people who are getting paid to do this work that I need to give them to finish. I need to give them this to finish their work. And so that was really important. I found that to be actually really helpful because I don't have, I have these loose deadlines that I give myself. And it's very much, it's never based on art. Like I never give myself like, I need to finish this thing by this day, unless it needs to go into a show or something like that. Most of the only way that I've managed to find out deadlines is from teaching. And again, it's like there are external factors that are depending on me. There are people who have signed up for this, or people who I told 3 months ago that I would be teaching this class and they've been waiting for it and I need to be there for that. And so that for me is like definitely, I think teaching has been a really good way of managing, putting some sort of parameters on time management. And also because then I go, I know that I have that class and then it's like, okay, I want to have this finished so I can show the students and kind of walk them through the process of making it, and I'll document it while I go so I can, explain to them. And so that becomes really, teaching has become kind of integral in me getting anything done.
Which is one of the beautiful things of, I was just gonna put a little cap on it and just say that that's one of the beautiful things of what, Luke, you've called the self-led life, is that, I mean, I can speak from recent memory. 125 days ago when I was still working for the Department of Education, all my deadlines were hard deadlines and they were top down. So it is a luxury to have some hard deadlines and some soft deadlines and have the wiggle room.
And I was always the person that was like, all these deadlines are arbitrary when I was working in fashion. I was like, this is completely arbitrary. And my boss is like, I don't care. You still need to do it.
I'm also noticing you have a lot of like daily routine commitments. You've got plants that are alive behind you. You've got chickens, like.
Yes, and that has been very important. Yeah, like I wake up and
that feeling of the daily routine.
And it is not something that comes naturally to me. It's like I wake up in the morning, I have to go make sure the chickens have water or they are let outside. I have to make sure that the cat gets his food. He's like immediately after that. And then I need to make the coffee. And that, there's this like immediate routine that walks into that kind of introduces the day. Yeah,
that's beautiful.
That I would not have chosen otherwise, but there are living creatures that are depending on me. Once again, it's like something else is depending on me. I'm like, okay, all right, I can do this.
But those are real deadlines.
Mm-hmm.
Those are hard deadlines. Those make sense. They got to be done.
Not arbitrary.
Otherwise, chickens are hungry.
And then if I sleep in and I hear from the coop, it's like, okay, I gotta get up. I gotta get up and give them water. Like I don't want a dehydrated chicken.
One thing, Christy, that I think about, and folks out in the audience, if y'all have any questions, feel free to chime in the chat here, and we'll get to them for sure. But Christy, listen to you talk about what the process of making the book was for you, raises in my mind the question of value, right? Like, how do we create value? How do we create real good, capital G, things in this world? And for me, something that I heard you say that points to that is you found it personally valuable to go through that process. Not only just creating something that's going to be of value for whoever reads it, but for you personally, right? It was valuable. Would you say that's accurate?
Yes, definitely. And I do think that I do find that to be important, where it's like, I need to be able to, even if I think something is valuable out in the world, I need to be able to find it fulfilling in some way. Otherwise, it's just not going to turn out as well. Like, does this need to exist in the world? Do I need to be the one that makes it? Those questions constantly. Yeah. Because sometimes I'm like, this definitely needs to exist in the world. And then I realize I'm like, I am not the one though. Like, I am not the vessel for this to come through. Yeah.
I love that kind of two-step rubric that you gave yourself to think about projects. Does it need to exist, and do I need to be the one to do it?
Yeah. Well, I love that. It is sometimes so difficult because, as a maker, you're sitting in your studio and you're like, this needs to happen, like this needs to be made, right? Like that's an easy one. Like, does it need to exist? Yes. And the second step, I think, is one that we often overlook, which is, am I the one who has to make it? There's a great cookbook called Bake the Bread, Buy the Butter, which is a cookbook on things that you should make. But it also, like, you go through and it's like, just go buy butter. Churning butter is a pain. Buying the stuff to make butter is massively more expensive than butter that is manufactured and is just as good as you can make it. And I think it's a really good way to think about things. There are systems in place to make things so much better, cheaper, more efficiently than maybe we necessarily have to.
Yeah.
Well,
Definitely.
I like that. Just because it needs to be there doesn't mean you have to be the personal one to do all of the work yourself.
Right. And I see that too. Like, I'm not necessarily, I'm like, oh, this community thing would be great. And I'm like, I am not the person to do that, as much as it's just not, that's not in my wheelhouse. Like, I can admire the work that other people, like this, what you guys have done here with soft folk. Yeah.
That question about boundaries and, am I the one, feels so similar to a conversation that I was having with Laura Brown, who's here in the audience, earlier this week, around mending clothing. And I'm getting ready to teach a mending class. I've got lots of mended things right here that I'm looking at. And like maybe the first 5 times a garment needs mending, like, yeah, obviously that doesn't take that long. It will still be comfortable. It's reasonable and right to mend it. But then, like, when it's like the 10th time it needs to be mended, and will it still be comfortable afterwards? Last month, I think I admitted to myself that one of my favorite shirts isn't comfortable anymore because I've mended it so much. It gets the thing I love about quilts, right? You quilt it and then it scrunches up a little bit. It's like the shirt just shrank a little too much from the stitching. I can't move my arms the way I want to. But for me, and I think when we talked to the zero waste chef about that as well, it's like, where do you keep saving it, doing the ethical thing versus when do you let it go? Like, when are you not going to wear the mended thing anymore? When is the scrap so small? Or like, when are they like ruining your life because your house is so full of things that you're trying to keep out of the dumpster?
Right. Totally.
Yeah, that reminds me of those kinds of questions. Am I the one to do it?
Right. Yeah. I recently last summer, I just was like, I'm going to take this giant box of scraps that I had sorted to make sure it was all natural scraps. And I was like, I'm going to go bury that in the woods. Not the box itself, but it's just like dug a hole, dropped the scraps in, I was like, I'm sorry. This like just needs to be returned to the earth at this point. The
artist Emma Freeman would encourage you to go dig those back up and make something with them now.
That has been
now that nature's had a chance to collaborate.
That is a regular thought that I have where I'm like, well, now I can go. And my boyfriend's like, no, oh my God. I think you have enough scraps to work with.
I would like to chime in, and then I also see that Adamandia has a question. With the idea of like, does it need to be made and doesn't need to be made by me? It calls to mind an anecdote that Liz Gilbert tells and writes about in Big Magic, which I know a lot of us have read. And it's this idea that she had this concept for a novel. She started working on this story. It's a very specific story about, I believe it was like a ecologist, a female ecologist that went down to like the Amazonian rainforest and all these things ensue. But she gets like halfway into it, life comes up, and time passes and she doesn't finish the novel. And she's feeling kind of bad about it. But then one day she meets the author, Ann Patchett, and they just click, you know? And so Liz says, Ann, what you working on these days? And she says, well, I just started this new novel about this story of an ecologist who goes down to the Amazonian rainforest and all these things ensue. And so why she tells that story and what I love about it is it points to, it suggests the idea that ideas aren't lost, right? Like, so maybe an idea will come light on your shoulders. Imagine like a little bird or butterfly. And if you don't work with it, if it's not the right time, it's okay. It'll flitter off to somebody else for whom it is meant to be made. So I love that story.
Yeah, I think it will also kind of I love that story as well. I think it kind of reframes the idea of like ownership of ideas as well. The concept of owning an idea. It's like, no, it came by and you didn't have the time for it, and that's okay.
That's okay. Because it's the idea that's important, not the artist as much.
Yeah.
And that kind of taps into the question that we have here, which is, Christi, how do you keep the story and the meaning and the symbolism in your pieces connected to the physical pieces themselves?
I wish I did a better job, Adamandia. That's a really good question. Oftentimes it is kind of jotted down in the sketchbook with the sketch. There will just be a few lines that are describing exactly what was used and why. And that's kind of where it ends for the most part. When if it's like a piece, like a framed piece, I will oftentimes write it on the back. Like, let's say a lot of the pieces that I frame them on like a wooden, if it's stretched onto a piece of wood, I can then just jot it onto the piece of wood on the back. I'll often do that. But if it's in a hoop, it doesn't usually go with it. Yeah, it kind of just stays in the sketchbook with the initial idea. And then I find it months later, years later, and I go, oh, whoa. So.
Christi, that leads me to a very soft bulk kind of a question. You're talking about stretching your embroideries, either on a frame or a hoop, but I know you also embroider on clothing a lot. And we have talked a lot, kind of the first time we talked about soft bulk was this idea of, do you display a quilt hanging on the wall? Do you display it folded? Could it be crumpled? Like, how do you present a photo of a quilt? Is it soft or flat or rigid or not? Like you've got a beautiful textile hanging on your wall and it doesn't look like that's stretched. It looks like it's hanging soft. How do you know how to display something, like if it's meant for the body or if it's meant for a frame? Or do you have ways of displaying embroidery that's not stretched taut?
Right. I think that's an excellent question. Yeah, I often do I like the way that the fabric hanging. I also like, I'm just gonna like zoom it up to the front, up top there. I love that little arc that happens right there when you pin the fabric. That is something that I really enjoy. There's I have a piece over here. Actually, that's gonna take me too long to set that up, but I'm like, wonder if I can turn the. So this piece on the wall over here, where I've got 3 pins in it, and I love that drag on the fabric. So I do think that's something, but I do think that is the reason why I oftentimes don't finish quilts, is because I haven't like that it makes it so certain, like their final form has been decided. So for example, like this piece is done, it just hasn't been turned into a quilt, because what if it wants to be a jacket? What if this wants to end up on the back of a jacket someday? So different pieces. And I have all of these quilts that are literally like this one is the edges folded back. There's a backing on it and it's just pinned.
Straight pins.
It's just pinned with straight pins, just because I'm like, maybe it's not done like this yet. maybe I want to stretch it onto something. Yeah, with straight pins, which is really definitely pin things with straight pins and then fold them and put them in piles. That's a really great way to stab yourself on a regular basis. So yeah, yeah, that's a really big reason why I think I don't finish pieces, is because then it decides exactly what their final form is.
Mm. Could you
And
share?
we like live in that liminal space, right? Where anything can still happen.
Yeah, exactly. What was that, Heidi?
Yeah, it's like that pure potentiality. But
Yeah.
could you share a little bit with us about your concept behind soft work and clothing? Because I think I make clothes for myself in a way that's very similar, because I don't use a pattern. I often just like hold things up to my body and yeah, that seems right. But what does soft work in clothing construction mean to you? I feel curious about.
Yeah, soft work. It began as like a zine that I was making like years ago. And it was like this concept, and then I was like, wait, this needs to be a class. It was basically just like an introduction to thinking about sewing outside of the sort of traditional style of sewing, where everything needs to be very precise, and just kind of figuring out different ways of working with clothes and cutting clothes. And so for me, the combination of words as it exists in the class that I teach, the garment construction, it's kind of, the soft is, I like to think of like words and they're opposite. And so soft, the idea of soft being like soft in texture, but also the idea of soft as the opposite of hard, like soft as it allowing it to be the sort of the path of least resistance, basically. And I found a lot of the clothing construction techniques that I was taught over the years in college, in the fashion industry, felt very much not the path of least resistance. It felt very complicated. There were a lot of curves, things that we were sewing on the bias, and then all of a sudden on a straight grain, and trying to keep that seam straight, trying to do a flat felled seam on that. And I could not wrap my mind around. It seemed overly difficult. And so that's where the kind of the soft part comes about, is really just sort of like a way of describing the path of least resistance in kind of an abstract way. And the idea that when we take, there's this, when we take the way that a piece of fabric is woven in a square and we allow that softness to just drape over our bodies, it is no longer a square. It becomes a totally different form. We don't need to cut all these curves into, this curve is, I find very important, but, but as far as all these other curves, like many, especially when you look at many traditional garments, they are made to waste the least amount of fabric as possible. There's this amazing book called Cut My Coat, which I have right here. And it shows, I actually have 2 copies, and this one is still in,
And Christi, if you have a copy of Mystical Stitches, you should show us that too.
Yeah,
I want people to see what you did with the inside cover.
Yeah, definitely. So I'm just going to quickly unwrap this book. But basically, the way that traditional clothing is constructed is a way to use like as least of the fabric as you possibly can. And so seeing these layouts of these different garments, and how even like a little triangle that you would cut out for the underarm could turn into something completely different. So for example, like here's this layout for this dress where the author Dorothy K. Burnham has gone in. So this is panel A. These would be panel B, which are here. So she has sliced in an area for the sleeve to be set in. And then these tiny squares up here have been used to fill in that armhole. And so all of this different way of constructing where there is zero waste, and not because, just because it took 1,000 hours to construct the actual fabric itself. I love this one where the angle that we have created here, the artist has created on the sleeve, these triangles have then been gusseted into the front. So just thinking about that, yeah. So that for me is like again with the path of least resistance. Yeah.
Oh, neat.
And then work, just because it is work. It's not, the idea that like you don't just like learn in a day. It is like slowly building up a dictionary of tools. Yeah.
Do you have another class starting soon? Another cycle?
I'm starting one like this weekend, but it's all full in April.
Okay.
Yeah, so that will go on
I might
sale.
have to sign up for that one.
Yeah, you should.
Because it seemed like a pretty gender
Together, that would be
neutral, like
fun.
the garments I see you producing coming out of it seem pretty gender neutral, right?
Yes, yeah, it's intended to be just for whatever. Yeah, it's like based like looking at your own closet and seeing what you're really driven towards and kind of learning how to build your own bodies on top of that. You will learn how to shear fabric. You don't have to use that though. You don't need to put ruffles on anything. Yeah. Oh,
And
cool.
show us your book unless somebody has
Oh
a
my
question
God,
about
sorry.
what we were just talking about.
Yeah.
Because folks, she did this really cool thing with the cover I want you to see. Little magic.
Oh yeah, once again with the like, yeah, path of least resistance, very important like concept for me and my work. So this is my book, Mystical Stitches. And then the inside cover. What's that? And so this is because I was teaching embroidery and a lot of people were like, well, what am I supposed to do on the back? I heard that it's supposed to be perfect on the back. I'm like, why does it need to be perfect? Why are we all obsessed with it being perfect on the back? Unless you're making a dinner napkin, in which case, yes, you will see it from the both sides. Why does anybody care what it looks like on the back? So that was sort of having the inside cover of this book was sort of my way of just being like, don't worry about it.
From the
Allow
very,
the back
like
to
even
be-
pre-page one,
yeah,
one, like don't worry
even worry
about it.
about it. Just let go of it. Let go of what you think the back should look like.
That's so good. Y'all, this has been good. Y'all got any more thoughts, things we haven't touched on? Avenues to explore?
I mean, always, but I think I'm ruminating, and at the moment I'm sort of staring off into space processing. So I don't know that lots to think about.
I love what Nikki just said, because Nikki brought it back full circle for us. Our first question, how have you experienced magic in your own life recently?
Aw.
And Nikki said, being able to attend this has turned into my magic moment of the week. So Christi, I have a feeling we have you to thank for that. So round of applause to you. Thank y'all so much for joining us. We will be meeting fairly early in February because of QuiltCon. We try to kind of stagger it. So look for the next softball to be earlier in the month. And we'll be sending out very soon as YouTube processes the whole recording. We'll be sending out a follow-up email with various resources, like we talked about, Cut My Coat, Mystical Stitches, so, all the things we mentioned. We'll have links for you. All right, everybody, be well, and we'll see you again soon.
Thank you all so much for having me. Bye.
Bye, y'all.
Thank you.
Christi.